So after we develop a good core stability, really hammering home and putting some good strength on top of that is so important. We always think about core strength, and what I want to do is really narrow down some good options for you to target the core in different positions. So just like when we talked about stability, we need to work on abdominals, obliques, QL, these rotators. We need to strengthen the core in all different directions to make sure we're not deficient, to make sure we don't have any imbalances as far as abdominals are too overactive or too weak and low back isn't doing its job, or vice versa, to make sure we have a good, well-rounded core when it comes to strength, to make sure we have that proper length, tension, and strength in there. Okay, so now that we talked about stability, it's good to look at core strengthening exercises. The first few, we're going to look at more flexion-based exercises, so targeting abdominals and obliques. Always realize that stability, the spine is not moving whatsoever, okay? The spine is rigid, it's holding and maintaining its position. There's not a lot of stress at the joint, but when we start to get the strengthening exercises, that's when we start to really bend and torque the vertebrae to a greater degree. So being very careful at the end range of motion is important, because as we get to the end range of motion, that's when we're really overstressing those joints. So we don't want to push too far through those end ranges of flexion or extension. Okay, so first one, straight leg sit up. Okay, why I like this is just kind of similar to what I said a second ago. We're not flexed for a long time, so we're flex, 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 we're straightening. As we come back down, we're going nice, slow, controlled, and we just let that spine slowly come into contact with the ground. Okay? As opposed to if we were doing a crunch, here we're flexing, we're in flexion for a longer period of time, and we're really cranking to the end range of motion, holding and coming back down, so a little more stress through that lumbar spine. After that, everyone has heard of Russian twist. Being careful in flexion and rotation is very important, because that is typically a position where we are more vulnerable to disc herniation and disc bulges. So we want to make sure our back is up nice and tall, more of a neutral spine. That's going to protect our spine as opposed to falling into flexion. So I always say start with the lighter medicine ball before you go to the heavy one. Heels on the ground is a little bit easier. We can rotate side to side. Okay, we're not trying to crank. I think a lot of people are throwing their arms side to side. We want some spine rotation. So I like to personally keep the med ball within the limits of my shoulder, and then I'm rotating side to side to target those obliques. A little bit harder if we lift the feet off the ground. Back is flat, trying not to fall into flexion, and then rotating from side to side. So those are two good flexion-based core strengthening exercises. Next, if we want to strengthen the core into lateral flexion, pretty simple, very similar to what I just performed. If we had a dumbbell in the hand here and we were just dipping into the core, that's something we can do. Again, not a favorite of mine as far as exercises, but if we're trying to train the core in that frontal plane with lateral flexion, that's really the best way to do it, unfortunately. But I always prefer that suitcase carry, holding a single dumbbell in your hand and walking to create stability there rather than really strengthening this, because this is something that causes so much stress at the lumbar spine. But if you are careful that you're not overly flexing to the side, it could be a good exercise to really target obliques and QL. Okay, so if we're standing upright here nice and tall and without cranking on our end ranges of motion, if we're there more comfortable and we're working on squeezing and strengthening here, that could be good, but I want to really emphasize, do not go so far through the range of motion in that position. That is something that will really stress the spine. But if you are someone that wants to stay away from that, you want a safer alternative, just working on your single arm, the suitcase carry or farmer's walk, and progressively increasing your weight is something that will create stability at the spine and also a lot of strength if we start to jump up into those higher weights, 40, 50, 60, 70 pounds. I see people go pretty heavy on those, and that is a better alternative to that, more that lateral flexion or that lateral dip exercise. Okay, so last up, as far as core strength for rotation, I showed you a second ago the Russian twist. Could go into either category for flexion or rotation since it incorporates both of those movements. But if we're looking at straight rotation, using bands or some kind of cable column can be good. On this, letting that back foot rotate is important, because if I'm here and I'm just rotating and not letting that back toe come on the ground, I'm creating a lot of torque at the lumbar spine. But if I come up here and actually incorporate a little bit of hip rotation, I'm not creating as much rotation through the spine that I can really go ahead and strengthen those muscles in a safer way. So from here, rotate, nice and controlled. So I'm using those obliques, QL, rotators around the spine to rotate and control. So I can use it as a strength-based exercise, or I can go lighter and really power through to increase power at the core. But that is a good way to work on rotation. In addition to, you could work on that Russian twist exercise. Okay, so those are a series of core strengthening exercises. As you notice, you can kind of hear the tone in my voice. I really lean more towards stability than I do strength, because in working on stability exercises, you can improve strength, but working on strength exercises, you can't improve stability. And some of those exercises I showed you do create a lot of torquing and stress at the lumbar spine. So if you're someone that has previous history of a stress fracture, a herniated disc, any kind of facet joint issues, you may want to work on stability first, really hammer that home, and be very careful as you get into strength. Okay, so that's just a warning there. But hope you found value in that video. If you have any questions about strengthening exercises, feel free to reach out, and I'd love to help you more.